Bless and love, and welcome to another episode of Things You Will Ignore in U.S. History. I am Coach Pete. Today's episode, we'll be talking about Module 9 and 10, the Great Depression and the New Deal. Now, as we go through today's episode, be mindful of the essential questions. Could the Great Depression have been avoided? And what should the role of government be during economic crises? The nation's sick economy. As we covered during our previous episode, The Roaring Twenties, economists feared that the lifestyle and the economy of the 1920s could not continue much longer. Well, the superficial prosperity of the 1920s masked weaknesses that would signal the onset of the Great Depression. Key basic industries such as railroads, textiles, and steel had barely made a profit. Many Americans were living beyond their means using credit while amassing serious debt. Agriculture suffered after World War I as demand fell, crop prices decreased by 40% or more. This is what we call deflation. Now, as we covered during the 31st and 32nd President's GQVL, President Herbert Hoover is blamed for the Great Depression, while President Franklin D. Roosevelt is credited with ending the Depression. Here we can see some of the effects of the Great Crash of 1929. Investors lose millions and businesses lose profits, and consumer spending drops and businesses cut investments and production falls and workers are laid off and businesses and workers can't repay loans and banks run out of money and savings accounts are wiped out and overall U.S. production plummets and U.S. investments in Germany decline and allies cannot pay debts to the United States and efforts are made by Hoover. He cuts taxes and interest rates. He asked business leaders and employers to keep employment, wages, and prices at current levels, even though people didn't have money, even though the businesses didn't have profits. He also asked Americans to voluntarily join forces to combat depression by giving to charity. Now, I know that sounds like a crazy idea and something that you really want to ignore, but remember when we watched the 31st and 32nd GQVL, we learned that Herbert Hoover was a citizen, a private citizen in London, and he brought back 120,000 Americans before World War I from Europe. Like, he orchestrated that, all right? So when he is asking Americans to voluntarily join forces to combat the Depression by giving to charity, he's looking at it from a different perspective. He also promoted localism. Well, his response failed. Americans looked to the president to solve the crisis in America, and as you can see from the depictions, Herbert Hoover was not one that did it. Volunteerism fails. Most Americans did what's in their best interests, and in fact, the president's name became associated with suffering those homeless camps calling themselves Hoovervilles. FDR's fireside chats. Roosevelt made public radio addresses which he called fireside chats. In these speeches, Roosevelt appealed to radio's listeners to help getting his agenda passed. Letters would pour in following each of these chats would help pressure legislators to pass measures Roosevelt had proposed. It was instrumental in having organized labor. The American Federation of Laborers, they only included skilled white laborers, while the Congressional Industrial Organizations were willing to involve all laborers, including unskilled minorities and women. The Wagner Act. This gave unions the right to go on strike and negotiate with business management. Union membership rose as workers gained the right to collectively bargain with their employers. The New Deal also imposed banking regulations. You had the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This law allowed only banks backed by the Federal Reserve to operate in the United States. He also had the Glass-Steagall Act, or the Banking Act of 1933. Here's where we get the FDIC. The SEC Commission was also set up. The SEC regulates any trading, exchanging of stocks. There were several New Deal organizations, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, where hydroelectric plants would distribute electric power to the Tennessee Valley, that created jobs and raised the standard of living. There was also the NRA, that is, National Recovery Administration. This was designed to create fair practices in business. There was also the Social Security Act and the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. The Social Security Act provided a safety net for retirees based on the amount of taxes they had paid throughout their life. When younger peoples all lost their jobs, there was no one left to take care of the elderly. So what were the causes of the Dust Bowl? Well, farmers didn't rotate their crops. The healthy topsoil eroded, turning into worthless dust. So what were the effects? Well, farmers had to move westward to escape the terrible conditions. So many left Oklahoma and Kansas. So what was FDR's solution to the Dust Bowl? Well, let's go back to that organization, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. They planted trees in the soil to prevent further erosion. This New Deal program gave many jobs to young, unmarried males. Over 1 million jobs was created. Progress Administration. This agency created tons of jobs, mostly for unskilled workers. It put artists, musicians, photographers, etc. back to work. Now, if we can remember from another one of our assignments, an evaluation of the New Deal, here we have it laid out that the legislation that we call the New Deal, it was aimed at fixing banks and the stock market. FDR approved plans to aid the unemployed and the nation's farmers. He began housing initiatives and ventures into public-owned electric power. But how effective was the New Deal at addressing the problems of the Great Depression? Well, however comprehensive the New Deal seemed, it failed to achieve its main goal, ending the Depression. So what did end the Depression? World War II. All right, quick summary. Let's start at the Great Depression and the New Deal. As we can see, if we go over to the right, Hoover was too little, too late with what he had tried to do to end the Great Depression. So then if we move from the Great Depression and the New Deal to the left, we see Great Depression in bold, up the popular culture, the WPA artists, the Dust Bowl. Oh, then we see the causes of the Great Depression: speculation, high tariffs, Federal Reserve type money, stock market crash, overproduction, underconsumption. Then we move from Great Depression down to the characteristics. What were the characteristics of the Great Depression? Well, production decreases, and businesses close, high unemployment, mortgage foreclosures, and banking collapse. Whoa. Let's go back to the Great Depression and the New Deal. If we go under it, we see Franklin D. Roosevelt's what? The New Deal. Oh, wait a minute. Let's move to the right. FDR's court packing plan, 1937. What did he try to do? He tried to get more court justices. People didn't like that. They were like, that's shady. Made them look bad. Bad. Very bad. Oh, wait a minute. Let's go back to the first New Deal. There we see the banking crisis and the FDIC. Remember that legislation helped to regulate the banks. Then we looked relief for the unemployed. Remember that civilian conservation Corps, the CCC, and we move down to the recovery. Yes, Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, helping farmers. Oh, let's move to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Now we look at the second New Deal. We see WPA, we see Social Security Act, and we see the Wagner Act, remembering that labor was organized. Thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of Things You Will Ignore in U.S. History. This episode has been about the Great Depression and the New Deal.
Love comes, love takes us, love keeps us, love makes us.